There is a version of agnosticism I've heard put about which basically just says not knowing whether there is a God or not. And by that I don't mean not having yet devised a test which will establish the existence of a God, but the kind of occupying of a position of deliberate and kind of accepting unknowing. You have this idea of a God, but you have to embrace the idea that you will never ever know whether God exists or not. That's the kind of agnostic position I've come across a few times, and I've kind of seen it referred to in the negative in things like Francis Collins. He's a theologian. Sorry, it's a big pigeon above my head. He's a theologian who wrote The Language of God, and he did a talk on the Veritas Forum about his book The Language of God, which is crap, in which he starts off with a series of questions which he thinks are deep philosophical questions, like, is there something rather than nothing? Does the universe have a beginning? And, sure enough, is there a God? As if that's a meaningful question in the same, well, possibly it is in the same way as one of those others, but as if it's a meaningful question. But for me, it just presumes so much, you know what I mean? It's one of those questions like, when did you stop beating your wife? It presumes a certain kind of activity and a certain kind of set of concepts are in place, and a certain kind of set of attitudes are in place, which may or may not be refuted, or may not be demonstrated as true or false. But you kind of have to have those things in place first before you can run the test, or you just even imagine the possibility of a test. And that doesn't represent my agnosticism at all, and maybe it doesn't represent anybody. Maybe it's a complete straw man I'm presenting here, but it certainly does seem that way. Certainly, talking to or listening to some agnostics talk, and particularly to people like Francis Collins talking about these kind of questions. Is there a God or not? No. And why? Because the question doesn't make sense, in my opinion. It just doesn't make sense. Another analogy might be, a question about, are the inhabitants of planet Alba Farag, are they green-skinned or blue-skinned? Well, first of all, demonstrate there's a fucking planet, demonstrate there's some beings on it, and then maybe talk about the colour of their skin, with proper respect given to the kind of lighting conditions you're under. It just seems like it's that kind of a question. It presumes so much of the intellectual and conceptual frameworking that it's not agnosticism at all. Yeah, I think it's, as I say, that's probably a straw man just picking up on some stupid agnostics and not these sophisticated agnostics we get here on YouTube. But I do also sense it, and I may be wrong here, I also sense it in some of the discussions of what I guess might be considered more sophisticated understandings of God than the one that's, the guy in the sky with the beard, that kind of understanding. Because I do hear people talk about God in and theology more generally in this kind of via negativa way, and I do it myself. I'm susceptible as the next man to that kind of religious crap. In that kind of cloud of unknowing way, or this the idea of the void and the source and all that kind of mystical tradition that comes through people like Plotinus and through some of the Eastern traditions. That okay, there's not a guy in the sky with a beard, but there's some kind of, well, it's almost like you're deifying ignorance itself. You're taking the fact that you posit a question, doesn't make sense, you acknowledge that you don't know the answer to it, you dress that ignorance up, unfounded ignorance, you dress that unfounded ignorance up in kind of metaphysical talk, and then it becomes a deity, it seems to me. Okay, it's a slightly more cloudy and vaporous deity than the one that Francis Collins probably bends his knee to, but it's still the same thing, I think. It's not really agnosticism. It's being Gnostic about its own agnosticism. It's worshipping the cloud, I think. I think it's worshipping the cloud. And yeah, that's all. I've just those two problems I have with some versions of agnosticism. One which is this kind of nuts and bolts, Robert Heinlein kind of agnosticism, in which you overdetermine the subject that you're trying to claim might or might not exist. And the second is the deification of unknowing itself.